All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the final installment of our ongoing series, The Long History of Race Relations in Florida. So glad that you're able to join us for this program this evening. My name is Keith Simmons. I'm the Communications Director at Florida Humanities. And I'm just going to give a brief introduction for this program, what to expect for this evening, and then I'm going to turn it over to my co-host and the panelists that we have assembled for this evening's program. So the Long History of Race Relations in Florida is a series of discussions convened by Dr. David Jackson, a professor of history at FAMU and a member of the Board of Directors for Florida Humanities, and Steve Seibert, former executive director of Florida Humanities. And the goal of this series is to convey stories about Florida's Black history spanning from European settlement in the 16th century to the present. These conversations are essential to have in our present moment, and we are proud to work with prominent scholars across the country to make this series possible. We also understand that these conversations can also inspire a lot of passion. Florida Humanities does not endorse any of the comments made by presenters or by attendees. Indeed, our objective is to facilitate a lively, authentic, and enlightening discussion on these topics. To that end, our presenters will keep the remarks brief, and then we'll open the program up to questions. Members of the audience will have an opportunity to ask your questions. You can simply type them in the chat box that's here in Zoom, and we will do our best to work your questions into our conversation this evening. At the end of the presentation, you will receive a short feedback survey in your email. We would greatly appreciate it if you could take a minute to fill it out for us. Let us know how we did, ways that we can improve next time, and perhaps some of the topics that you would like to see us pursue in the future. Again, this is unfortunately the final program in this series, but it is really only the beginning of a very important conversation. The recordings of prior programs are available now on our website. You can go to floridahumanities.org/Black History to view these previous programs in the series. We also have a number of other virtual programs that are coming up on our calendar. You can view those by going to floridahumanities.org/events to register for those. And finally, your support is essential to helping to sustain these programs. If you enjoyed tonight's program, we ask that you consider visiting floridahumanities.org/support to contribute to Florida Humanities. That's the way that we can continue to make these programs possible and to continue to bring them to a variety of audiences. With that, I'm now going to turn the program over to Steve Seibert, who is one of the moderators for today's discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Simmons. This summer, after the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and others, the Florida Humanities Board declared, "It is our obligation to use the humanities to understand racism and injustice and how to curb their influence in society." And as Keith just explained, to that end, board member Dr. David Jackson offered to moderate this four-part series. The humanities are the stories of our human experiences, and they're told through the lens of what we value. Our hope in this series is to deepen our understanding of race and history and culture and law so that we can more honestly address the issues of this day. Let me introduce the man who made all of this happen, Dr. David Jackson. He is the Associate Provost for Graduate Education and the Dean of the Graduate College at Florida A&M University. He's been a professor of history there since 1997. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Memphis, a master's in public administration from Florida A&M University, and a bachelor's in history education, also from Florida A&M University. He has 5 books to his credit. He has won every award and honor that you can get in the teaching profession. Just at Florida A&M, he has been Teacher of the Year 3 different times and is listed among who's who among American teachers. He's civically incredibly active. The list goes on, but just as examples, he has sat on the Florida Humanities Council board since 2015. He has sat on the board of the Florida Historical Society, the Center for Global Security and International Affairs, the University Press of Florida, and the Florida Historical Commission. He is a proud alumni of the Marching 100. He is an iconic figure. He's a terrific board member and a great guy. Dr. David Jackson, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Steve, for a wonderful introduction, especially the part about the Marching 100. Quite sure my colleagues and Abel Bartley love to hear that when you're introducing me. I want to thank Mr. Keith Simmons for helping to facilitate this discussion. And also, Steve, want to really thank you for all that you've done, the initiative that you took to actually come to me to talk about brainstorming what we could do to make a difference to serve the citizens in the state of Florida. So we appreciate you for that. And I think that, your association with this project will mean a lot to people throughout the state who will have an opportunity to take a look at it for years to come. I also want to thank the members of the Florida Humanities Council Board for their support. As Steve stated, our board members were supportive of the promulgation of more knowledge about the experience of African Americans in the state of Florida. And so we appreciate their support as well. And so as Mr. Simmons stated, we have had a three-part discussion in a four-part series on the long history of race relations in Florida. Our first discussion began with a talk about Spanish colonial and slavery in Florida. And it was conducted by Dr. Larry Rivers and Dr. Anthony Dixon. We moved from there to a discussion on Reconstruction and Jim Crow in Florida and talked about Florida's exceptionalism. And I presented a paper there, Dr. Will Guzman and Dr. Tamika Hobbs. And last week we had a discussion on the theme of I Am a Man, the struggle for civil rights in Florida. And we had Dr. Abel Bartley, who is back here with us again today, Dr. Paul Ortiz, and Dr. Irvin Winsbrough. And so we're going to close out this series really by drawing a nexus between the theme of the late 60s for the sanitation workers strike in Memphis, where people were protesting and saying that they were in fact human beings, saying that they were men. And we're going to try to have our scholars today to frame that and have a discussion around the Black Lives Matter movement and the current struggle for civil rights and racial justice in Florida. So we have a group of dynamic scholars who are here with us this afternoon, who are going to share their knowledge with you. And I'm going to present or introduce them in the order in which they will be presenting. The first scholar we have is Dr. Darius Young. Dr. Young is an associate professor of history at Florida A&M University and director of FAMU's Quality Enhancement Plan. He is a two-time graduate of Florida A&M University with a bachelor's degree in African American Studies and master's in history, and he holds a PhD from the University of Memphis. Dr. Young is an expert on civil rights and popular culture, and his book has been well received, which was published in 2019. The title of his book is Robert R. Church, Jr. and the African American Political Struggle. Dr. Young is an outstanding professor and has also been awarded the Teacher of the Year Award at Florida A&M University, which is saying something. The next presenter is Dr. Tiffany Packer. Dr. Packer is an assistant professor of history at Florida A&M University. Formerly, she worked as a history professor at Johnson C. Smith University in Charlotte, North Carolina. She is a graduate of Florida A&M University, where she holds a bachelor's degree in African American Studies. She went on to the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, to earn a master's degree in history, and she holds a PhD from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, in history. Dr. Packer is also an expert on civil rights and popular culture and women's studies, and she's done extensive work on the civil rights movement and the sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina. Like Dr. Young, Dr. Packer is one of our winners of the Teacher of the Year Award at FAMU this year. So we're very proud of her for all that she's done. Finally, the last speaker will be Dr. Abel Bartley, my colleague and friend from Clemson University. Dr. Bartley is a professor of history at Clemson and served as the director of Pan-African Studies there for over 10 years. Dr. Bartley is a 3-time graduate of Florida State University. He holds a bachelor's, master's, and PhD in history from FSU. He tells me that he's a former football player at Florida State and played on the team with Deion Sanders, but I haven't seen any pictures to validate that, but I'll take him for his word. And Dr. Bartley is an expert in African-American and African studies, but his most notable book is Keeping the Faith, Race, Politics, and Social Development in Jacksonville, Florida. So he's done extensive work on African-Americans in Jacksonville. So we're very pleased that we have these scholars with us. I want to thank them publicly for taking time out of their busy schedules to join us this afternoon. And without further ado, I'd like to turn the program over to Dr. Darius Young. Dr. Young.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Jackson. I'm not surprised that you were able to recall all those things just off the top of your head, especially since you're my former professor and mentor. So I hope I make you proud today. It's good to see everyone, even my colleague, Dr. Packer, who we're both in Tallahassee, but unfortunately, due to the current climate, we're not able to see each other as much. I want to thank Dr. Jackson again for inviting me. Keith Simmons, who was an outstanding student at FAMU and was an award-winning essayist at FAMU. And so I want to see him on this side of the camera on one of these panels very soon. And Dr. Bartley, it's always a pleasure to be in your company. Dr. Bartley would harass me oftentimes at conferences on my way up. And so he helped shape and mold my research as well with his thought-provoking questions and challenging me even at our luncheons and things of that nature. So Dr. Bartley, it's always great to see you. Today, I'm going to really kind of provide a little context for Black Lives Matter and really at least try to frame it in the traditional civil rights movement and talk about Black Lives Matter, not just as a new movement that we've seen in the 21st century, but an extension of the Black freedom struggle. So I will go ahead and share my screen. So yeah, you know, one of the things that I've been on numerous panels, like so many other of my colleagues over the past few months, discussing the current racial climate in Florida throughout the nation. And oftentimes we'll have some conversation around the Black Lives Matter movement. And one of the things that I've noticed in those conversations and some of the questions is that people don't quite understand what it is, that it has been categorized or characterized in different ways, mischaracterized oftentimes. And so I wanted to at least go through the Black Lives Matter movement, connected to this larger Black freedom struggle, to familiarize us with how nuanced the civil rights movement was and how it continues to be this more nuanced, sophisticated, complex form of activism that does not always fit into that king top-down narrative. The origins of the Black Lives Matter movement really starts in 2013. For the most part, it comes into our living rooms the following year in August 2014, when Darren Wilson, a white police officer, shot and killed Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, a suburb of St. Louis. And it really set off a social movement against anti-Black violence. And we've seen the eruption that happened in Ferguson. But when we look at the roots, Florida, and what happened in Sanford in 2013, when this young man, Trayvon Martin, was killed by a vigilante, sparked a hashtag that will later grow into a movement. From that hashtag, we've seen it grow and grow and grow through various political protests, candlelight vigils, die-ins, marches, so on and so forth. And it has really shaped not only Black politics, but as we could see over the past few months and it coming to a head this past weekend, it has shaped the national political discourse as well. When we think about the movement, I think it's extremely important to give credit to the individuals who created that hashtag. The co-founders of that network. It begins after Trayvon Martin is killed and a person by the name of Alicia Garza here in the middle, who put that hashtag and started a new conversation around this current freedom struggle that we're in. She's joined by Patrice Cullors and Opal Tometi. All three of these individuals are veterans and had already been active, that they did not become awakened after Trayvon Martin's killing, that they were veterans and already tapped into a network, and the movement that happens as a result of 2013 is not by mistake. This has led, but really they're not the face. And a lot of times when we're having conversations, people have been very critical of the movement. Those of us who are very familiar with the civil rights struggle and used to this king-dominated movement, certain individuals at the top of the movement, that Messiah-like presence that we tend to think about when we look at the civil rights movement, the Black Lives Matter movement does not have that, right? And so people will criticize it and they say, well, where are the leaders at? What are they fighting for? Where's the organization, right? And have been very critical, and in some ways have criticized the younger generation for not really being conscious of the way that they approach it and using that King civil rights traditional narrative to denigrate the Black Lives Matter movement. But I'm here to say that the Black Lives Matter movement is a part of a longer tradition. Just like the current movement that was started by these three women, it has direct correlation with a movement that was started by another important, brilliant, powerful woman by the name of Ella Baker, who was very much disillusioned with the typical Black freedom struggle and organizations and having these male-led, male-dominated movements. And she challenged those young people in 1960 to have this group-oriented movement, made the argument that strong people do not need strong leaders. And so the roots of what we see in the Black Lives Matter movement can directly correlate to what we've seen in the 1960s with that SNCC movement and the lessons that we've learned from individuals like Ella Baker. Oprah Winfrey, maybe a couple years ago, was one of those people who was very critical, right? It said, where's the leaders at? That it's a leaderless movement. And the young women came back and said, it's not a leaderless movement, it's a leader-full movement. And I can remember individuals in the movement who have not really received credit in the traditional civil rights movement who said, you'll be amazed at how much you can get done if you're not worried about who gets credit. And so the fact that it doesn't have that one individual to point to makes it that much more dynamic and that much more powerful, that anyone who has the best interests of the issues that the Black Lives Matter movement represents can not only be a part of it, but can view themselves as a leader within that movement itself. I think the Black Lives Matter movement is also rooted in grassroots activism, which leads us to some of the things that was discussed last week. I had a chance to catch the panel last week, and I think you all did a great job, that we as scholars have to do a better job of centering those local movements to move beyond that King narrative. That we need to talk more about people like Patricia Stevens-Dew and Priscilla Stevens and the work that they did with the Congress of Racial Equality in the 1960s in Tallahassee, Florida. We need to talk more about what's happening in places like St. Augustine, Tampa, right? When you see these wade-ins and individuals pouring acid into the swimming pool, those conversations are as much a part of the civil rights movement and has to be more visible and discussed more in the narrative of our remembrance of the movement. The Black Lives Matter movement is an extension of that they're not waiting for one individual to give them a call, that you see hundreds of different marches and protests and demonstrations that are happening throughout the entire country. In these local communities from individuals who we would not necessarily classify as leaders, who may not fit into the same ideas of respectability that we associate with individuals like King. So for me, the Black Lives Matter movement challenges me to learn more about that grassroots activism, to learn more how to organize and mobilize people on a local front. That Florida has a rich, long history. Dr. Bartley has done some great work on the movement in Jacksonville. I have used his articles on the unrest that happened there in 60 and 64. We have to continue to tell those stories. Another criticism oftentimes of the movement is that people classify it as violent. And you start to see political leaders like our governor who criticize individuals in the Black Lives Matter movement and use dog whistles like Law and Order in order to quell some of the work that they're doing. Black leaders in prominent Black cities have criticized the movement in some of the places where we have seen some unrest, and they're often reminded to remember King, that King and the marches and the SCLC, they set the standard. That's the only way to show your displeasure with what's happening in American society, and that is the proper way to protest. For some reason, in our romantic remembrance of the movement, we've come to think and to really believe that the civil rights movement was nonviolent, that everybody approached the movement from that perspective, that King would participate in a nonviolent struggle. And I challenge those individuals to go back and look at Birmingham, to look at all the issues that he encountered as a leader within the movement. King would be critical, but also provide some perspective, and often say that riots are the language of the unheard. In some ways, when he would have those conversations with important political figures, presidents of the United States, he often said this is in some ways the more natural response to white oppression. Jesse Jackson was on CNN with Don Lemon a few years ago after Ferguson, and Don Lemon remarked something, about the people out there. I just wish they weren't out there, quote unquote, rioting and burning and looting and all these other things, and they need to do it like you all. And even Jesse Jackson reminded him, you do remember that Watts happened while King was alive. that Detroit 67 happened during King's lifetime, that Tampa 67 happened in King's lifetime. So we have to remove ourselves from this romantic remembrance of the movement that people were just out marching, singing, "We shall overcome." And that played so heavy on white Americans' conscience that it forced the United States government to make certain changes. You have to put yourselves in the position of those individuals. Again, people are upset. We have to look at the circumstances. What's happening here, what's happening in Ferguson, what's happening in Wisconsin, all these places where Black people have been murdered by police officers on top of all the hell that Black folks were already catching. Right? What is prompting them to feel that this is the only option we have, that I would be willing to risk everything to bring about some change? Why are Black folks having to answer questions about quote unquote violence that's happening in these communities and not what has provoked them to move to the streets in that way? That oftentimes, even if permit, no permit, all these things that DeSantis is talking about, when people are in a peaceful protest and they're met with a militarized police force with AK-47s, tear gas, all types of weapons, riot gear. If I'm in a protest and I'm met with that, those individuals have now escalated the conflict. So it's not that the Black Lives Matter movement wanted to move into that direction. When we see things erupt, it's often because they are provoked, right? And so I want us to think about that. And I want us to connect it to what really happened in the 50s and 60s, and not just this romantic remembrance of the Montgomery bus boycott, the 63, I Have a Dream speech, so on and so forth, that this was and has always been a bloody, violent struggle. And we need to think more critically about the individuals who are in desperate enough situation to feel that this is their only option. So I wanted to close by challenging us to think more critically, to be less critical of the Black Lives Matter movement, to remember the individuals who have lost their lives. Dr. Packer has done some great work with Jonathan Farrell, which, you know, I'm imagining she may go into some detail about. I left him out on purpose because I know she's done some great work with him and his family, for Trayvon Martin, right? And understand that they're unfortunately a part of a long history, especially here in Florida. Over 300 lynchings occurred. When we look at individuals like Harry T. Moore, Martin Chambers, Dr. Bartley with, you know, his work in Jacksonville on Johnny May Chappelle, 1979, 1980. You had the situation that happened in Miami, that this has been, unfortunately, a continuation of white violence against Black lives for generations. And these individuals who are part of this movement are just continuing that struggle. And with that, I'll end there.
Thank you, Dr. Young, for a riveting presentation and for getting us off to a rousing start. And so we want to transition directly into Dr. Packer's presentation at this time. So Dr. Packer, it's on you.
All right, good evening. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes.
Awesome. I was having some audio problems earlier, so I just wanted to make sure before I jumped in. First of all, I want to thank you guys for the invitation to come and speak about an issue that is just so prevalent right now, and particularly familiar to Florida. I want to acknowledge all my panelists. It is really, really an honor to share this space with you and stage, if you will. Dr. Jackson is definitely he's such the standard, a mentor of mine and somebody who has been very instrumental in shaping me throughout the years. Um, and of course, Dr. Young, it's always a pleasure to see you as well, my colleague, my brother, on so many levels. And I'm just glad to be a part of this. All right. So I want to just kind of pick up and talk about some of the things where Dr. Young left off, right? Because one of the things that I always argue is that we can talk about, theories, we can talk about things in past tense, but what I've learned is that people don't really pay attention, that students or otherwise, unless they see how this impacts them, right? So I want to try to give you something you can touch, right? Something that you can take with you, or perhaps we can look through together as ways to look at case studies and ways that Black Lives Matter has shown up in the state of Florida. When I first started putting this together, I said, of course, we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter in Florida because we're in Florida, duh. But what I realized after I started putting this together was that even if I was in California, I would still have to talk about Florida, because Black Lives Matter has been such a, Florida has been such a center in Black Lives Matter. So I want to go back and start again with Trayvon Martin. Dr. Young, of course, ushered him in so well. All of you, I'm sure, probably familiar with, but of course, this was a 17-year-old African-American male shot and killed by George Zimmerman in February of 2012 in Sanford, Florida. And I noticed me and Dr. Young used one of the same images, which is just very telling. This picture. I tell students all the time that pictures can tell stories the same way that words in a book can, right? And so it's something about this image of Trayvon that is just so piercing, and one that causes us to look at it. Now, what we all know is that police brutality in communities of color is nothing new. In this case, white vigilante violence is nothing new. And so one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is then, why is it that Trayvon Martin was that spark that really was responsible for jumping things off like we had never really seen before? And so there are a few reasons for that. One is that in the past, when we talk about how, say, police interact with people of color in particular that have a very unfortunate outcome, oftentimes those incidents are dismissed if you're looking at that person's criminal background, even though they may not have anything to do with the encounter that was had. If we are talking about, oh, well, did they resist, or were they carrying a weapon, right? These are all reasons that are typically used to dismiss holding police or white vigilantes accountable. So the fact that you have Trayvon Martin here, who was just simply living, right, is the way that I wanted to phrase it. A young boy who gone to the store for Skittles and an Arizona iced tea, minding his business, had to defend himself in a way that ended up unfortunate for him. That just struck a nerve in a way that other recent police shootings really hadn't, not shootings that we were aware of, okay? There was no initial aggression. Him being followed was unwarranted. In fact, those familiar with the case know that George Zimmerman was instructed not to pursue. And lastly, but perhaps more importantly, what was responsible for really setting people off with this case is the fact that he was a child. Okay, so it's the same type of, I would say, lesson or point that we may see or get from a children's march, right? That if you are acting this way towards children, okay, then what is that telling us about what you're doing to other populations too, like women, grown women or grown men who are falling into the same sort of demographic? So as the young people say, Trayvon Martin kind of hit different, right? Which is why he was able to kind of jumpstart this Black Lives Matter movement as we know it, okay? All right, so one of the things that his case also brought to the forefront was the issue centered around stand your ground. And if you're in Florida, then of course you are probably very familiar with this. But those that may not be, this was a legislation that was passed in Florida in 2005, which in short just kind of set these guidelines, right, for when and how people can defend themselves if they deem it necessary, okay? It allegedly is supposed to apply when a person has a reason to believe they are about to be the victim of serious violence. But what I found to be really interesting about this legislation, well, a few things, but there is no obligation to attempt to flee first. And in most other states, before you say that you are defending yourself, you have to prove that you first tried to get away, okay? With stand your ground, you don't have to do that. All you have to do is just say with your mouth, hey, I felt threatened. And so then on top of that, this law provided immunity to law enforcement officers in the line of duty. So this really solidified this treatment of communities that, police have, sworn to protect and serve. And so this certainly is not just limited to communities of color in terms of who's being impacted, but it certainly is being damaging, okay? So when we talk about Black Lives Matter, we have to own the fact that there's much reason for it to be present and for it to be very active. So I wanted to show very quickly 2 case studies, though, of how we have seen Black Lives Matter come into play, but even more importantly, how we have seen it be effective, okay, particularly, well, for the nation, but particularly for the state of Florida. Marquis Mclaughton, some of you may be familiar with, was a father of 4, who was the life partner of a woman by the name of Brittany Jacobs. Mclaughton was shot in Clearwater, Florida in July of 2018 at a convenience store by Michael Draker. Okay, so some of you might be familiar with this case. In short, Marquis and his partner and their 3 children pulled up to this convenience store, and his partner, Brittany, was driving. And according to her, the vehicles were blocking the regular parking. So she then chose to park in a handicapped space. And so Mr. Draker, after Marquis Mclaughton went into the convenience store with his son, Michael Draker approached her and started to fuss her out about being parked in this handicapped space. And so Marquis saw what was happening, and he ran out of the store and he confronted Michael Draker. He pushed him to the ground and told him to back up, talking to his partner like that. He was defending his woman, right? And so what Draker did in response, even though Mclaughton was turning away from him, is that he shot him. And Marquis ran back into the convenience store and collapsed in front of his son, where he died, right? And so Draker was not arrested because he was claiming stand your ground. And so he actually was free for 20 plus days before even being arrested. And when he was arrested, he began to cry, and he cried because he was being taken away from his dogs. He talked about how he was going to miss his dog, his pets, right? All right. One of the reasons why the law, though, ended up acting on arresting him and charging him and actually eventually convicting him was a result of Black Lives Matter really putting the pressure on officials in Clearwater, Florida. And so when we talk about, are these movements impactful, the short answer is absolutely, positively so. The other case I want to bring to you, and I'm gonna wrap this up, but I could not end Corey Jones, Florida, who was well known in his community as a local musician. He played for his home church. He also worked as a home inspector. And so as he was leaving a gig one night, headed home about 3 a.m. in the morning, he starts to get car trouble. And he pulls over and he has OnStar in his vehicle, and he contacts them and asks for a tow truck. Well, while he's waiting, this white unmarked van pulls up, and a man gets out in plain clothes and starts to approach him. And so Jones actually got his weapon, allegedly, and didn't point it, but was ready to use it to defend himself, with him being out at this time of the morning and having a stranger approach him. And so when the plainclothes cop that we now know was a cop, but did not know at the time, approached Jones. Jones told him that he was fine. And allegedly the cop then will see the gun, and he will proceed to shoot Jones and kill him while Jones is out there waiting for the tow truck. And it is the OnStar people that will call for the ambulance and so on and so forth, right? Why this is important is because it's important. It's important because it's important, right? But for the sake of this conversation, he, according to the Washington Post, will become one of 990 victims that have been shot and killed by the police in controversial cases. And his family will fight for a year to get justice for Mr. Jones. Again, Black Lives Matter steps in and really works to bring attention to this case and puts the pressure on the city. And as a result, the cop actually was sentenced to 25 years in prison. And this is the first time in the nation that a cop has ever been convicted of shooting someone who allegedly was armed, right? And so this is a clear victory that I think deserves to be celebrated, because, you know, a lot of times we can ask ourselves, well, what does the protesting do? What does you talking loud do? And so in short, these are the answers. Oftentimes these movements show up in local spaces. Oftentimes it's local spaces that we start to see change happen. Okay, so is Black Lives Matter relevant? Absolutely, positively. Okay. And is there always continued work to do? Absolutely, positively. So I have more that I have in my presentation to share, but for the sake of time, I'll stop. But I will say that Jonathan Farrell, Dr. Young, I couldn't let it go. Jonathan Farrell, who was shot in Charlotte, North Carolina, which I'm in right now, by the way, was shot and killed by Charlotte Mecklenburg police officer Randall Carrick, and originally from Tallahassee, Florida, also a Rattler. His unfortunate death really went on to continue to bring attention to the need of movements like Black Lives Matter. And what they tell us, right, is that it is not just for us to look for leaders, but we have to be our own leaders. And if we are not keeping the records, then chances are we're going to see these people as statistics rather than understanding them as real people who function in real time. So the Corey Jones, the Marquis Mclaughtons, the Trayvon Martins, the Jonathan Farrells, yes, the Breonna Taylors, we have to continue to say their names and continue to do their work. It is our duty, and it is the foundation that has been laid by the ancestors in the civil rights movement, and certainly beyond and before that. So I'll stop there, and thank you for your time. And anybody who may be interested in my presentation, I'll be glad to share since I didn't get to finish.
Well, thank you, Dr. Packer. And again, such an elucidating presentation. And it synchronized itself very well with Dr. Young's presentation. So, you all know I'm very proud of you. And I want to thank both of you for dropping some knowledge on me and inspiring me in the way that you do. Next, we'll have the final presentation by my colleague and friend, Dr. Abel Bartley from Clemson University. Dr. Bartley.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Again, I want to thank my esteemed colleagues, fellow panelists, Dr. Young and Dr. Packer. You did a wonderful job. You literally read stuff from off my notes, and I want to say, you know, I'm so proud to see how you all have. But I knew going last, I wanted you all to demonstrate your brilliance. It does show the power and the value of HBCUs for our society, that it takes raw talent like that and molds it and shapes it into world-class historians. So I'm just impressed to be in your presence, such august figures. And I did enjoy both your presentations, and it does demonstrate a tremendous amount of preparation and knowledge on your part. I also want to thank Dr. Jackson. Dr. Jackson is one of the most talented young men in the South. I really think he really impresses me. He's the kind of person that can walk in a revolving door behind you, come out in front. I don't know how he does it, but he's a tremendously talented young man. I want to thank Dr. Seibert and also Dr. Simmons also for their work on this project. And I want to thank everyone for who joined us today. This is such an important topic. I'm going last, and last week I got to be the youngest guy, and this week I guess I'm the oldest guy. But one of the advantages you get with age is you get to see things from a different perspective. One thing that I tell my class, and now I realize now after you put 50 candles on a cake that the clock doesn't go backwards. And so you get to see things from a different perspective. You get to have a 10,000-foot perspective when you're a little older on things. I want to start out with a little quote from James Baldwin, one of my favorite writers on the South. James Baldwin says that the South is very beautiful, but its beauty makes one sad because the lives that people live here and have lived here are so ugly. It is one of the big ironies of the South. The South is one of the most beautiful places. We have beautiful beaches. We have beautiful palm trees. It's such a gorgeous place, but our history is so ugly. It is a history of abuse and oppression that would rival any history anywhere else in the world, and it's so sad when you think of it. I'm a Southerner by birth. I spent 10 years in the North and chose to come back South because I love the South. I'm a Floridian by birth, and my research continues to be on Florida because to me it's such a fascinating place. But Florida is also an interesting place, and I just want to take a 10,000-foot look at this notion of Black Lives Matter and why it's so important and why I'm so impressed with you all for joining us today and for having this discussion, because it is so important. It is so timely for this period that we're living in. It's ironic that just 3 or 4 days ago, I was the keynote speaker at Southern Wesleyan University. They were doing a program on this subject of should Christians be involved in Black Lives Matter? And I was amazed at the level of hostility that some of the students had. This place is training Baptist ministers, future Baptist ministers, but I was amazed at the hostility they had towards Black Lives Matter and the argument that it was a distraction and that, you know, it was inherently racist when you add the word Black Lives Matter. No, it's hitting all lives matter. And it was really interesting to me how much more work we have to do in the South. I'm beginning to become like W.B. Du Bois in that I'm beginning to become frustrated because the longer you teach and instruct, seems the farther we get away from our ideal society. But there is hope in the younger people. Well, I'm going to start off by talking, when you talk about Black Lives Matter, and again, with the advantage of age, I get to look at this story from a bit farther distance than most people. Arthur McDuffie was a 33-year-old Black ex-Marine and insurance salesman who borrowed his cousin's motorcycle. Just before 2 a.m. on December 17th, 1999, Dade Metro Police Sergeant Ira Diggs III spotted a speeding 1973 orange and black Kawasaki, and he gave chase, reportedly announcing on his radio, "I'm going to get that guy." More police officers joined in the pursuit. It reached speeds of 100 miles an hour, with McDuffie rushing past red lights and stop signs, perhaps because his driver's license had been suspended, or perhaps because some of the lawmen had already started shooting at him. 3 Metro officers, Alex Marrero, Mark Meyer, and Charles Ververker, according to court pleadings and various statements, caught up with him about 8 minutes inside city limit. When McDuffie slowed down, Meyer testified that McDuffie immediately shouted, "I give up." It did not matter. What happened next was that the officers used their billy clubs and flashlights to beat McDuffie. And not only beat him, but beat him to death. Then they staged the scene to make it look like McDuffie had suffered a crash and had died as a result of a motorcycle crash. Luckily for us, there was an independent investigation, independent coroner's report, which stated that McDuffie's injuries did not match or did not look like a motorcycle accident, but instead was a result of a beating from these policemen. What followed was a trial in which the lawyers for the policemen were very slick and very good at eliminating African Americans from the jury, and ended up with an all-white jury, which, to no one listening surprise, found the officers not guilty, even though it was clear that they had beaten McDuffie to death. This is part of a long story. What happened next was riots in Miami and across the United States as people began to protest the idea that an African American could be killed by the people whose job it was to protect them. Then we go on, and in Los Angeles, we have the situation where a man by the name of Rodney King is beaten on camera by policemen, given more than 60 licks from policemen using their nightclubs and their flashlights. And again, we have a trial. And again, you have an all-white jury. And again, you have a not guilty plea, which continues. Now, what I'm trying to set up for you is this notion that Black lives did not matter at that time. The fact that you could kill an African American and have a coroner's report say that this was murder, and yet you get justified by the jury, then you can have on tape an African American being murdered, and then have the jury justifying it on. African Americans began to realize that there was something wrong with the notion, because our country starts out with the idea that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among which the first one is life. And if African American lives don't matter, no lives matter. And so what we had begun to do, really from the first time we got here in America, and some people put that 1619, others get it even earlier, is we have been trying to say we are somebody and that our lives need to matter. And so the civil rights movement that began really in 1619, it picks up steam in the 1960s, because what African Americans were making the point was our lives matter. If the laws don't apply to don't apply for African Americans, they don't apply for anyone. Which takes us then to a subject that both of the previous speakers spoke about, that is also very cogent and very much on the news: the story of Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin's crime. I've looked at this thing to try and figure out what is the crime. You have a young African-American kid who is doing what almost all kids do. He went to the store, he bought some Skittles, he bought something to drink, and he was walking home. Just the mere presence of an African-American who has his head partially covered because he's wearing a hoodie, and he's bothering no one and listening to music. For that reason, someone, a young man by the name of George Zimmerman, felt that he had the authority and he had the right to question someone who was, all he was doing is exercising his God-given rights of life to be able to get some Skittles, go home, and enjoy his life. George Zimmerman stops him. We don't know what the conversation was. All we know is that after this confrontation, this young man, 17 years old, with so much promise, with so much to live for, is dead. And the other thing we know, as if it's a repeating nightmare, a jury comes and they justify the murder. And once again, you get the notion that African-American lives don't actually matter in the United States. In Jacksonville, Florida, my hometown, another case that's important, and even though the person was convicted, it still tells us a lot about what African Americans have to deal with on a daily basis. On November 23rd, 2012, a 40-year-old software developer and gun collector confronted a group of African American teens who were sitting in a car listening to music at a gas station. This man, named Michael Dunn, confronts the team and tells them to turn their music down. Somewhere in the confrontation, this man picks up his gun and fires 8 shots into the car, killing a young African-American male by the name of Jordan Davis. Again, what was his crime? His crime was he was playing music too loud. In the United States, we have a series of laws that we give a certain level of punishment, the ultimate punishment to, which we call capital crimes. These are crimes that are so egregious that our society has voted that if you commit those crimes, you no longer deserve the right to be part of civilized society. Capital punishment is reserved for the worst criminals and the worst crimes. The problem with the South and the problem with the United States in general is that this capital crime has been placed on a group of people, African Americans, and they have been sentenced to this crime or to this punishment for doing nothing except living their lives. Think about it. As an African American, we recognize that we have been criminalized just simply for being Black. It is a situation that no one in their right mind would accept or would justify, except in the United States and in the South. A place that has dehumanized African Americans to the point where someone can kill them and then you can justify it. When you look at the civil rights movement, what African Americans were actually struggling for, when you break it all down, was something very simple and something very straightforward. All they were asking for is, can we be treated fairly as human beings? Can the same laws that apply to the rest of society apply to us? Unfortunately, in the United States, for years, when you look at the notion of race and racism in the United States, most of our white brethren have viewed it as a zero-sum game. In other words, if African Americans get treated humanely, if African Americans get civil rights, it will by definition be taking civil rights from whites. And as a result, they have been willing to use violent means to keep African Americans from enjoying the rights that everyone else enjoys just simply for being part of the United States. It is unbelievable to me to think that the United States hates a group of people who loves the country so much. Every war that the United States has fought in, African Americans have fought. Every major incident or issue that the United States has been engaged in, African Americans have been engaged in also. And yet, one of the things that we have been battling for since our existence in the United States is just simply the opportunity to be part of the United States, to be part, to allow ourselves to live in the society as equal citizens. It is sad to think that some people in this last election did not vote for the Biden teams just simply because they did not want a woman in office, and others because they did not want a person of color in office. It is a sad state in the United States that even after all of these years as a country, we still have not progressed over the issue of race. And so when you talk about Black Lives Matter, what you're talking about is all American lives matter. Because if all American lives don't matter, no life will matter. Think about this for just a few moments. When we say Black Lives Matter, all we're saying is this. If a home is on fire in a neighborhood and the fire department comes, the fire department will pass a lot of houses to get to the house on fire. Now, does that mean that the houses that they pass are not important? No, it does not mean that at all. What it means is that they are concentrating on the house that needs the attention. So when we say Black Lives Matter, what we're saying is we need to concentrate on the group that needs the attention. African Americans are the ones that are being shot down, that are being killed in the street, and nobody is being asked or nobody is being forced to pay for the consequences. And so what we have to do in the United States, if we're ever going to reach our potential as a nation, is we're going to have to somehow or another get past what Baldwin called our ugly history. Somehow or another, we're going to have to give up on the notion of us versus them, Black versus white, and we're going to have to begin to look at ourselves as Americans. Because if our laws and our rights and our privileges do not apply to everyone, they don't apply to anyone. And the sad thing is, after years of preaching this and teaching this, it seems that we've made progress, but we've also regressed. And so my presentation, I'm bringing to an end so other people can get an opportunity to talk, but I just want you to look at Florida's history and look at the notion, all the violence, all the oppression, and then ask yourself the question, which house is on fire? And that will explain why Black lives have to matter. Thank you. We can go to the question.
Thank you, Dr. Bartley, for bringing it all home, Reverend. We appreciate it. Great job. And I think you all have certainly stimulated the thoughts of our participants, the audience members, that is, who are with us. So I want to thank you all for an outstanding job. And I know we're going to transition into questions at this point. And so I'll just take a point of privilege and really kind of tee up a question that I was thinking about during you all's presentation. One of them is the issue around institutionalized racism. And so when I think about a person like Callie House, who was in Tennessee and led one of the early reparations movements, Marcus Garvey, and then when we move into the civil rights era, we see Bull Connor and the unleashing of the National Guard. If you look at the story of Garvey, Garvey was ultimately charged with defrauding, using the mail to defraud. But the white citizens in this country have been able to use the powers of the government to oppress Black people. And African Americans have not been able to take those same tools to oppress other people in the country. And so even when you all were talking, I was thinking about the young man, Martin Lee Anderson, who was killed over in Panama City when he was in the boot camp at 14 years old in 2006. He was in an institutionalized setting and he was effectively executed. So I just want you all to kind of address the issue of not just individualized racism, but also institutionalized racism, where the tools of the government itself are being used to oppress people who are insisting upon their rights and to be treated as human beings in this society.
I'll start, if you don't mind. You know, one of the misrepresentations that people have of the civil rights movement and all that is that African Americans were asking for special rights. That's not true at all. All we ask is that the law be applied equally to everyone. And when you talk about the notion of institutionalized racism in the United States, I look at it this way. if you were a left-handed person and you attended school, what you had difficulty because all of the desks in the schools were designed for right-handed people. Only 10% of our nation, of the world, ironically, is left-handed. So we have a right-handed world. So if you're left-handed, you have to make accommodation or make adjustment for living in a left-handed world. The United States was built on the principle of whites and white supremacy, and all of our institutions were built that way. So when African Americans are in the United States, by definition, they have to adjust themselves to fit into that system, and it does not work. The world was made to advance white. This world, the United States, was made to advance white. It was not made to advance African Americans. And so African Americans have to do something extraordinary or different in order to participate and be counted in that type of a system.
You know, I would like to add to that as well. You know, if we just have like some real life examples of that, if we take the life of Philando Castile, right, or what happened with Philando Castile, you know, here he was. Yes, he had a weapon in his car, but he had a permit to carry, but he was still understood as a threat. If we stay here in Florida, and we talk about Marquis Mclaughton, or if we talk about Corey Jones in particular, who there was a weapon that was found by his body when the ambulance came to help to assist, right? But nobody's talking about the fact that he too had a permit. So when you talk about things like stand your ground laws, you know, who does it apply to exactly? You had Marquis Mclaughton, who was trying to defend himself. You have Corey Jones that was trying to defend himself. Then you have Marquis Mclaughton, who was trying to defend himself and his family by pushing Michael Draco to the ground. You know, why didn't stand your ground apply to him? Instead, it defaulted to Mr. Draco, right? And so what are the implications then? The implications is that even when Black people are doing things legally, there are still all of these connotations that are associated with it, and Black people are not able to act freely, right? So that's how we can see it showing up in real time.
And when we see the government and the role, the active role that it has played generation after generation in maintaining that type of Black oppression, I think Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, does an excellent job of showing how, despite whatever the official system is, whether it's slavery, whether it's convict leasing, whether it's sharecropping, so on and so forth, that a caste system is always maintained in American society. When we look at it today, it's now the prison industrial complex, right? And targeting African Americans, oftentimes for nonviolent crimes, but it's enough to strip them of political, having their political capital and being able to determine elections such as the one here, right? In Florida, we can see how much of an impact something like that can have. It prevents individuals from realizing their true economic potential, education potential, so on and so forth. So Black folks have always been in a position to try to force the American government to live up to its ideals and the Constitution, and to really fully embrace the idea of American democracy. That has always been the burden of African Americans, and it continues to be the burden of Black folks in this country today.
Thank you. Mr. Simmons, you want to ask some of the questions from the chat?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dr. Jackson. I do want to get to the questions that have been posed throughout the chat and using our Q&A function. By the way, you can add to that using either of those functions if you would like to add to your questions, and we'll try to work as many as we can in our remaining time. One of the questions that I want to pose just to start off is for all of our panelists, and certainly including you, Dr. Jackson, because all of you are educators. And all of you, I believe, have spoken, I'm sure at some point or another, about the role of students and youth in some of the earlier eras of the civil rights movement. And that oftentimes it's been students that have done some of the most provocative actions when it comes to trying to push for change. So do you feel any concern or any hesitation when it comes to talking about those types of issues with students? And the reason why I ask is that we have a lot of educators who I think are participating in our discussion tonight. And I think a lot of them are sometimes perhaps concerned about, if I talk about things like student rebellions, like the student rebellion at FAMU, is that something that could be problematic or possibly cause some sort of problem? So what sort of, I guess, professional advice might you provide about navigating those types of issues?
I teach the civil rights course at FAMU, and I have an article coming out on the FAMU student rebellion in '68 after King was assassinated. I think it's important to talk about the students' role within the movement, because it's often been young people who have really challenged the nation to move forward. And at FAMU in particular, they inherit a great legacy. One of the slides that I show was of Patricia Stevens Dew and the core movement that happened in the 1960s, the sit-in movement that happened in the 1960s. It's a great book that just came out this year. Jelani Favors, who's winning a bunch of awards, Shelter in a Time of Storm, that looks at Black student activism at HBCUs. That in order for us to continue to push America forward, oftentimes that falls on the shoulders of young people in particular, both Black and white, to continue to push for that change. I think it's extremely important, though, to talk about how detailed, complex, strategic young people were and deliberate in bringing about that change. I know it was a comment in the section in the chat earlier that referenced the nonviolence. My argument that even in the quote unquote nonviolent struggle is still extremely violent. Those kids, those young people embrace wholeheartedly that idea of nonviolence, but that came through education and workshops and trainings, and really embracing that as a lifestyle. What I'm talking about is the violence that they encountered in a place like Montgomery, Alabama, with the Freedom Riots, where their bus was bombed and they were beaten to a pulp after they got off. That's still a violent struggle, even if the actors in it are not. I think Birmingham was another case where dogs were sick on 7-8-year-old babies. It's a violent struggle, and it can't just be interpreted from the Black activist perspective. What's not talked about in the history books is the Black people in those communities who aren't a part of that very select, trained group of nonviolent protesters. And I believe that is beautiful, and you know, I applaud everyone who played a role in that movement. But what's not talked about is the Black men in the communities in Birmingham and Montgomery after all that went down, who were rolling around with shotguns, making sure nobody came to their house. That we can't allow this one narrative of the civil rights movement dominate what happened within the Black freedom struggle. And young people have to know how complex, how they did it, how deliberate and intentional these individuals were to bring about the type of change that they brought about in the 1950s and 1960s.
And let me say, I think that's an excellent answer, Dr. Young, so it's hard for me to add anything to it. But I will just add, just from a different perspective in terms of for educators and having these conversations, the educators need not be concerned about what the students are going to do, because the students will work it out with each other. The problem is the adults who are the ones that overreact and create the dynamic that we are discussing today. It's the adults who are going out and killing African-American men, hunting African-American men down, like with Ahmaud Arbery over in Georgia. That's more the dynamic. The young people will work it out. And I think one of the themes, particularly during the civil rights movement of student activism, was that the students, when they went in particular way to college, the employers could no longer punish their parents for the students being engaged in activism. And so that's why you see a number of these young people in Greensboro and Tallahassee, all over the South, their parents could not be involved, and they were frustrated with the situations at home, but they were able to express themselves more as they went away to college and matured into activists and young adults.
And can I just add this one point? Those activists that we see in the 60s are all that really come of age in 1960, 1961 are 14, 15-year-old kids in 1955 when Emmett Till is murdered. And that Till generation and how that murder inspired them once they came of age to go and be active in the movement is exactly what we're seeing 7, 8 years later after Trayvon Martin, and how that murder, when these people that's in college now were young middle school and high school students, how that inspired them to look at the world differently. And we see a movement grow out of that. Formerly Crystal Frazier, now Dr. Crystal Akahemi, a FAMU graduate, professor at Tennessee Tech now, wrote an excellent article on the Till generation that really details how the movement grew. I can leave that information for Keith to distribute. But again, those individuals were deliberate, extremely well-versed, disciplined, and should be applauded. And we need to tell that story.
Can I add just one other thing that also we need? I remember I had a conversation with the late Dr. Joseph Lowry, and he said that during the civil rights period, they loved using kids because kids didn't know enough to be scared. And I think what you see is if you have an opportunity to inspire kids, I looked at what happened in South Florida when the young man shot up the school and how kids all over the world became activated on the issue of gun violence. It never can help. Knowledge can only help. It does not hurt. And we have an obligation as educators to dispel knowledge, to give knowledge. And if this knowledge can empower the next generation, let them do the work that we're scared to do or we just have not done. I don't think we should ever be afraid of the consequences of knowledge, because that's how society progresses, because they take advantage of knowledge.
Well, if I could just add something very quickly to that, to echo all of my colleagues and what they had to say to that. But what we have to remember as educators too, is that, it's our job to give it to them the way that it needs to be given. And as I always say, if you don't leave feeling convicted, if you don't leave even feeling maybe offended sometimes, if you don't leave feeling no particular way, then the history is not being taught correctly. So we can't be afraid, right, of, this idea of repercussion. But this is what's also true, is that classrooms are one of the only places that you can go to and do what you do, say what you say, and talk it over without, I should say, fear of consequence, right? And so it's our duty as educators to protect that space, especially in college classrooms. I mean, this is one of the only places where you can come to without penalty. And so it's our duty to give it to them like it should be given, not to mention that, to just kind of back up everything that's been said, that is also how you plant the seeds of Ella Baker, right? That's when you plant the seeds of activism and consciousness in these spaces, because otherwise they're going to leave thinking that I'm not king, and if I try, I'm going to die, right? So let's just forget about it. When you plant those seeds and everybody realizes that they have a place, right?
I think that's also very excellently put, Dr. Packer. And I want to follow up with you with a quick question, something that you raised in your presentation in talking about the number of African Americans who had been killed by either law enforcement or vigilantes. You use the phrase "say their name," and when we talk about Black Lives Matter, that's certainly a slogan, and "say their name" I think is another slogan that's also out there that a lot of people may not really understand what it is or the importance of it. So I wonder if you could just talk for a moment about what that phrase means and what the importance of that phrase is in talking about some of these issues that we're facing.
Okay, so that is a perfect question because it's just a really good question, but it also helps me put a period on my presentation because I actually was going to end talking about this concept of say their names and ways that we can kind of keep that type of momentum going and strategies going, right? You know, one of the things about when you talk about statistics, as I kind of hear you saying in the question, right, is that anytime you're talking about statistics, it can be problematic. So if we're talking about waiting on the police to give us data on how many people have been impacted by their violence, can we really trust that data? And so what happens is that we have to then pick up the spirit of people like Ida B. Wells, right? Who decided to keep her own records and write her own stories. In her case, it was lynching in the traditional sense. How do we keep a record of these people and how do we write about them? Because that's the thing, is that you cannot, look, I can't go to France, but if I, you know, all of these wonderful, fantastic articles that Dr. Young keeps publishing, right? And Dr. Bartley, these books he keeps writing, and the ones that Dr. Jackson have already done, they can show up in France or wherever, Africa, you know, Antarctica for that matter. So this idea of saying their names helps to really kind of fan out how people understand. And traditionally, America, now, cares about its international image. And so if we get that word out, if people are saying the names, and people are going to start to pay attention, and we have to keep record of it. And I have a student project that goes on in my 20th century class, right? Where I have students of their, you know, from their own choosing to pick someone who has been victimized by police brutality. And I have them to put their stories back together, to rehumanize them. You know, what was their favorite color? What did they like to eat? Were they married? What were their hobbies? You know, what did they do? What were they into? You know, just so on and so forth. Because this is how we stop people from becoming statistics, to being understood as real people who function in real time. And if you understand real people who function in real time, then you know that this is real, okay? And that this also can happen to me. And the only difference between myself and the people that I'm writing about is where they were when they were. All right. So otherwise, I'm on the chopping block too. If you humanize it, then you can relate to it. And if that doesn't move you, then you don't have a pulse. So say their names is imperative.
Absolutely. No, I think that's, again, thank you for I think providing that insight. I think that helps our audience out quite a bit in terms of why say their names matters so much. And I know we're getting a little bit closer toward the end of our time, but I think that these presentations that we've gone through this evening are touching on something that I think a lot of people are just sort of struggling with, which is based on this information that all of you provided, and based on the positions that people have, just based on their race, on their gender, and things like that. It's a desire to try to move things forward. And that's a pretty large question to figure out how to make progress on some of these issues. And perhaps we can just start to talk about some of those things in terms of when we have someone say, well, you know, if I'm a white male, how can I start making progress on dealing with some of these issues, or talking with people in my networks? You know, how do I make the kind of change that I want to make to make communities better? So I wonder if the four of you could perhaps just talk for a little bit on that subject. I know it's a large one, but I think it just speaks to a lot of anxiety that people have about this issue, regardless of race. Just how do we start to make progress so that we can truly change some of these situations?
I'll go first, and because I had to answer this question 2 nights ago at Southern Wesleyan, and you know, like they said, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? One of the things I think that you have to do if you really want to make progress on this, you can't treat everybody the same. And let me explain what I'm saying. if you're a parent, you know you have some kids you can just say something to and the kid will do it. You have other kids you say something to and they ignore you. You say something to them again, they ignore you. You can't treat everyone the same. What you have to do is you have to recognize that people come with a history. They come with baggage. They come with a past. And so when you see an African American and you interact with them, they may not respond the same way that everyone else responds because they have a past that they're dealing with. And so what I encourage people to do is don't treat people the same, treat people equal. And what I'm saying with that is this: be open to the fact that even if you say I'm sorry, or even if you do show your contrition, not every African American is going to respond the same way. But you need to have the patience and you need to have the courage to keep trying. Keep putting, like every teacher, keep putting that key in the locks, and eventually you're going to unlock the door. And so that would be my advice. Don't treat everybody the same. Treat everybody equal.
I'll say really quickly, the late Dr. Bobby Wright used to say that if you know better, you should do better. And so if I look at the example of someone like Steve Seibert, for example, is that he had the option of not having that conversation with me, but he felt comfortable with coming to me saying, David, we need to do something to address some of the things that are taking place in the nation, and in particular as it relates to the state of Florida. And so I think that, people have to be willing, if they want to do something to make a difference, then they can find a way to make a difference, right? And so I think you have to have a willingness first, a desire to make those changes, and then you can move from that point. Part of the issue is that a lot of people don't want to make those changes because they fear what the alternative may be for them. And Dr. Bartley, you talked about that earlier.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to what my colleague said is to be open and to listen and to be willing to listen to those conversations. We can see change happening by even presidents having to address the issue of Black Lives Matter. That's the start in terms of those specific issues entering even our national political discourse. To listen to one another, to really be open to some of the issues that are being expressed, to try to identify with the most pertinent issues that we see associated with a movement like Black Lives Matter, and to become active agents in being progressive and bringing about some change, to have conversations with individuals who would not normally be in Florida Humanities Council panel session on a weeknight, right? That the conversation has to extend beyond the individuals in this Zoom chat, right, in this Zoom, and for us to take that information to continue to tell those stories to members of our community and to challenge them to think more critically about race and these other issues that continue to be problematic in our country.
I just think I will add very quickly, my colleagues, answer that perfectly. But I just want to remind everyone, and perhaps this is preaching to the choir, but, the fight for equality is not just a Black problem. It's not just, a minority problem. Minority, I don't like that word, but for the sake of conversation. Everybody who is committed to the idea of justice and equality has a role to play. And so I like to always make that clear in my classes to everybody, right? If you are human and you believe in equality and rights, you have a right to play. And even though the role of, say, whites in the movement has been controversial, the fact of the matter is that no major movement has really made progress without allyship, right? And so in many ways, it's necessary. But in many ways, we should work on that becoming natural, right? That everybody has a role to play in progress and making sure that everybody's able to progress.
And that was
Black
one
Lives
of the
Matter
things
movement.
that was the promising symbols about the movement over the summer, was that in many cities you had more whites out protesting and and holding up Black Lives Matter signs, because they are of a different generation where they're looking at the inhumanity that African Americans have experienced. They've gone to school with African Americans. They don't have these hangups that previous generations had. And then when they actually see this stuff being broadcast on television, and someone mentioned in the chat about the ubiquitous nature of cell phones, right? You have all this video footage. The George Floyd situation is not really new. Was more or less new about it is that it was filmed, right? But these types of incidences have occurred, but it's promising that the young people are the ones who are willing to make a change. So back to the point earlier that Steve, Keith asked, I mean, those are the young people that we need to train and provide them with the proper information so they'll have the right perspective, because knowledge is power. And with that information, they can go out and make a positive change in this society.
And let me just say, the civil rights movement, the Black freedom struggle is not about a product, it's a process. And so regardless of whatever concessions or whatever legislation is passed, that we understand that systemic racism is ingrained in our society. And it's not about a product, it's about the process. And we have a responsibility to continue to fight the good fight.
Thank you so much again for all of those responses to that question. I think it certainly does get to this idea of starting to address some of these core issues that we have. One of the things that I would like to do as we're sort of approaching the close for our program this evening is I wanted to provide an opportunity for Steve, if you had any thoughts on this particular session that we've had today, or any of the other sessions that we've had over this 4-part series, if you wanted to perhaps offer a reflection.
Thanks, Keith. I've been writing down notes here, and none of them rise to the level of being important enough to say. The stories, the narrative that Dr. Jackson, you and the scholars that you've brought to this program and the last 3 programs have been staggering at times. The messages and the lessons and the histories are often not known, and they are certainly often not known to white people. And so one of the challenges, the great challenges that just keeps coming to my mind in after listening here, is how can I learn the history I was never taught? And how can I participate in conversations that almost never occur? And so to me, that's the challenge that David, you and I have, and that we all have. How do we do this? How do we change? How do we change how we communicate with each other on these issues? Mm-hmm. And this is a noble effort. The time that you and the scholars have taken is a noble effort, and these conversations will live arguably forever. And as you said early in the program, that teachers can pull them and can help people understand what they probably don't understand because we've never been taught it. So all I can say is I'm moved and I'm grateful.
And again, I want to just thank all of our panelists for this program and for all 4 of the programs for your participation and echoing Steve's comments. Very happy to report that we've had nearly 1,000 people attend these programs in person, or as close as we can get to in person by being here on Zoom. And so we certainly hope that this is going to be the beginning of a series of very important conversations about Florida's history. So once again, thank you so much for all of you, and especially for those of you who have joined us for every single one of these programs and helping to carry this content forward. So as I mentioned at the beginning of our program, you are going to receive a survey. Let us know how you enjoyed the program, ways that we can improve next time, and the topics that you might want to see us explore again in the future. We're certainly open to those ideas, and we're going to compile all the information and other things that have come out throughout this series and make it available as a resource hub. so everyone can get access to the recordings and some of the books and articles that have been mentioned by our scholars as a way for you to continue to learn about this topic moving forward. And again, if you're interested in seeing any of the other programs we have available, you can go to floridahumanities.org/events to see our upcoming calendar. And if you found this program to be inspiring, we can absolutely use your support to continue to make these programs possible. So we ask you to consider visiting floridahumanities.org/support and making a contribution so we can sustain these programs into the future. So again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and thank you to all of our panelists for your participation. It's greatly appreciated. And until next time, take care.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you.
Appreciate you all.
All right, yeah.
Thank you.